Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the chilling case of Edward Rulloff, the genius killer, and his double life of brilliance and blood that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know, where are you listening to this story from? That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. In the hallowed, climate-controlled silence of Cornell University's psychology department, an object of singular horror rests under the unwavering gaze of academic scrutiny. It sits bathed in a cold, sterile light, the kind that seeks to dissect and understand, yet seems only to amplify the profound mystery it holds. Preserved within a large glass jar, floating weightlessly in the amber-tinted formaldehyde that has defied decay for over a century and a half, is a human brain. It is a pale, grotesquely oversized mass of convoluted tissue. Its volume measured at an astonishing 1,673 cubic centimeters, one of the largest and most complex brains ever recorded. For decades, scientists would study its intricate folds, searching its physical matter for some flaw, some dark anomaly that could explain the abyss of evil it once contained. They found nothing. This is not the brain of a celebrated statesman or a revered philosopher, though its owner possessed an intellect that could have eclipsed either. This is a monument to a terrifying paradox. The mind that once animated this tissue was a genuine prodigy, a force of nature in the world of letters and thought. It was a mind that could command 8 languages with the effortless precision of a native speaker. It was a mind that could spend its afternoons translating the dense, intricate prose of ancient Greek texts and its evenings formulating complex revolutionary theories on the very origins of human language. By every metric available to 19th century science, and even by the standards of our own time, it was a brilliant mind, a vessel of almost limitless intellectual potential. And yet, this very same instrument of genius orchestrated a series of brutal, cold-blooded murders that sent shockwaves of terror across the pastoral landscapes of New York State. This brain belonged to a man named Edward Howard Rulloff. He was a master of disguise, not of the body, but of the soul. To the world, he wore the respectable masks of a teacher, a doctor, an inventor, and a philologist. But beneath them all, his true and unchanging face was that of a killer. For decades, authorities, legal scholars, and a fascinated public would grapple with a fundamental and deeply unsettling question: how could such profound, demonstrable brilliance coexist with such a monstrous capacity for calculated destruction tonight? We shall pull back the curtain of time to uncover the chilling truth behind the man the newspapers of his day called the genius killer. It is a story where the noble pursuit of knowledge became hopelessly, terrifyingly entangled with an insatiable thirst for blood. To understand the man and the monster that lived within him, we must leave the sterile silence of the university archive. We must travel back in time to an era of profound faith and fervent hope, an era that was tragically unprepared for the darkness that was about to walk among it. The year was 1842. The rolling hills of central New York were alive, not just with the bounty of the harvest, but with the spiritual and intellectual fervor that defined the age. The recent completion of the Erie Canal had been a miracle of engineering, transforming what were once sleepy, isolated farming communities into bustling hubs of commerce and vibrant intellectual exchange. Ideas now traveled as swiftly as goods. Simultaneously, the fires of the Second Great Awakening, A powerful religious revival had swept through the region, instilling in the populace a passionate belief in social reform, in temperance, in abolition, and in the perfectibility of man. In this new ascendant America, education was elevated to the status of a secular religion. It was seen as the primary pathway not just to prosperity, but to moral and spiritual elevation. Small, aspiring towns like Dryden, nestled just east of Ithaca, competed fiercely to attract learned men scholars, doctors, and lecturers who could bring the light of worldly knowledge to their rural corners, proving that they were part of this great national journey toward enlightenment. It was a landscape of almost boundless optimism, a society intoxicated with the promise of self-improvement and the inherent goodness of humanity. And it was this very optimism, this deep and trusting reverence for intellect, that made it the perfect hunting ground for a predator of unparalleled cunning. Into this world of hope, a phantom from a much darker world arrived. The man who called himself Edward Rulloff was, in truth, a carefully constructed lie. A masterpiece of deception designed to exploit the very virtues the community held most dear. His true story began not in a prestigious lecture hall, but in the grim, soul-crushing confines of a prison cell. He was born John Edward Howard Ruffson, near St. John, New Brunswick, around 1819. From a young age, his intellectual gifts were undeniable. He was a voracious reader, a boy who consumed books with an intensity that astonished his teachers. But this gift was tethered to a dark and corrupting flaw, a profound contempt for the rules that governed other men. As a teenager, working in a dry goods store, a series of suspicious fires were eventually traced back to him. They were clumsy acts of arson, designed to cover up his systematic theft of inventory. He was caught, convicted of embezzlement, and sentenced to 2 years in prison. For most, this would have been a moment of reckoning. For John Ruffson, it was a dark epiphany. Prison was not his punishment. It was his university. It was there he learned the supreme value of meticulous, patient planning. It was there he studied the weaknesses of others, learning how to read their hopes and fears. Most importantly, he learned that a respectable facade was not just a defense, but a weapon. Upon his release, he walked away from his old life, shedding his birth name like a snake sheds its skin. The man who crossed the border into the United States was no longer John Ruffson, the petty thief. He was Edward Rulloff, the scholar. The transformation was absolute. He had forged a key, the key of scholarship that could unlock the most guarded doors of respectable society, allowing him to move among his future prey not as a wolf, but as a trusted shepherd. When he arrived in the village of Dryden, the residents saw only this masterful performance. At 23, Edward Rulloff was a figure of immense charisma. He was tall and distinguished, with dark, meticulously groomed hair and piercing eyes that seemed to hold an almost intimidating depth of knowledge, as if he had seen and understood the world in ways they could only dream of. He stood in stark contrast to the rough-hewn farmers and canal workers of the region. When he spoke, it was with the cultured, confident accent of an educated gentleman, his voice carrying a natural authority that both charmed and commanded respect. The residents of Dryden, starved for intellectual stimulation, were utterly and completely captivated. Rulloff was a polymath, a man of seemingly infinite knowledge. He could recite long, complex passages in Latin, Greek, and German from memory. He could debate the latest philosophical works emerging from Europe with a nuance that suggested a lifetime of study. He held the townspeople in rapt attention with his public lectures on phrenology, the popular pseudoscience of divining a person's character from the bumps on their skull, dissecting its principles with an air of absolute mastery. He was, in every apparent way, the embodiment of the learned man they had so desperately craved, a walking testament to the power of the human mind. The community embraced him with an enthusiasm that bordered on worship, an adoration that fed his already immense and growing sense of superiority. He soon became an indispensable fixture of the town. He was first hired as a clerk in a local drugstore, where his encyclopedic knowledge of botanical medicines amazed both his employer and the customers who sought his advice. Soon after, in a testament to the town's complete trust, he was offered the position of headmaster at the local school. This role was his ultimate triumph. It gave him not only the final seal of respectability, but also unsupervised access to the impressionable young minds of the community. And it was here, in the classroom, among his pupils, that his gaze fell upon Harriet Schutt. At 17, Harriet was the daughter of one of the area's most respected and prosperous farming families, the Schutts, in a region known for its handsome women. She was considered a rare beauty, tall and slender, with long light brown hair and intelligent hazel eyes that sparkled with a gentle, curious humor. Yet, it was her mind, not just her beauty, that set her apart. She possessed a refined manner and an education that was uncommon for young women of her time, marking her as a member of the local gentry. The Schutt family represented the very bedrock of their community stable, hard-working and deeply respected. Harriet was their prized jewel, the embodiment of their values and their hopes for the future. The attraction between the worldly, sophisticated teacher and his bright, sheltered student was immediate, electric, and utterly catastrophic for a young woman like Harriet, whose life had been a safe and predictable journey within the provincial boundaries of central New York. Rulloff was a figure from another world. He was everything she had only ever read about in books, a man of deep learning, of exotic travels, of profound thoughts. He wove captivating tales of his supposed life before Dryden, painting himself as a scholar of the world who had, for a time, chosen their humble village as his intellectual sanctuary. Yet, even in the intoxicating glow of their early courtship, there were unsettling signs, faint tremors beneath the surface, portents of the darkness that lay beneath his polished exterior. These were the whispers that those around them, and Harriet herself, chose to rationalize away as mere eccentricities of a brilliant mind. His temper, when provoked, was terrifying in its sudden, explosive intensity. He displayed an almost pathological jealousy, his moods shifting in the blink of an eye from charming, eloquent affability to a cold, calculating rage over the slightest perceived offense. A friendly glance from another man toward Harriet, an innocent conversation held for a moment too long, these were enough to trigger a storm within him. The Schutt family, while publicly impressed by his learning, harbored private, unspoken doubts. They could not quite articulate the source of their fear, but there was something in their daughter's suitor, a chilling undercurrent of control and possession beneath the charm, that left them deeply and profoundly uneasy. But in the face of their daughter's deep affection and Rulloff's undeniable charisma, their premonitions were silenced. They gave their blessing, paving the way for a union that would be sealed not with a promise of enduring love, but with an unspoken premonition of an early, violent death. On the final day of 1843, as heavy snow blanketed the Finger Lakes region in a shroud of pristine white, Edward Rulloff and Harriet Schutt were united in marriage. The ceremony, held at the sprawling Schutt family farm, was simple but well attended, a gathering of warmth and community against the biting winter cold. It should have been a moment of unblemished joy, the celebrated union of the town's most brilliant mind and its most beloved daughter. It should have marked the beginning of a promising future. But even on this day, meant for celebration and new beginnings, the true nature of the man Harriet had just bound herself to began to emerge in ways that should have terrified every person present. The ceremony itself proceeded normally, the vows exchanged with solemn gravity, but then came the traditional moment when the minister, following a time-honored custom, congratulated the new bride with a gentle, fatherly kiss on the cheek. In that single innocent instant, Rulloff's carefully maintained facade of scholarly composure did not just crack, it shattered. His face, moments before alight with a husband's pride, darkened into a mask of cold, possessive fury. Several wedding guests physically recoiled, alarmed by the sudden and shocking transformation. His eyes, those same piercing eyes that had once captivated them with their intelligence, now flashed with a rage so intense and so unexpected that it cast a palpable pall over the entire celebration. It was a terrifyingly public display of the monster that lurked within. Here was a man flying into a jealous fury over an innocuous gesture from a clergyman on his own wedding day. Historical accounts from those who attended note that the festive atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a tense and awkward silence. The guests, unsure how to interpret such a disturbing and disproportionate outburst, chose the path of least resistance. They attributed it to wedding day nerves, perhaps, or the immense stress of marrying into such a prominent and respected family. But Harriet herself, standing at the eye of this silent storm, had seen something in her new husband's eyes that chilled her to the very bone. It was a glimpse into an abyss of darkness she could not comprehend. Yet, in a testament to his manipulative power and her own hopeful heart, she told herself it was not madness, but merely the overwhelming intensity of his love for her. The honeymoon period that followed was tragically brief and deeply troubled. It was a volatile cycle of passionate, almost desperate devotion, punctuated by flashes of the same terrifying rage that had marred their wedding day within months of their marriage. Rulloff had convinced Harriet to move with him from Dryden to the nearby village of Lansing. His stated reason was a desire for privacy, a chance for them to build their new life together away from the prying eyes of the community. The truth, however, was far more sinister. The move was a calculated strategy, the first step in a campaign to methodically isolate his young wife from the protective influence of her family. It was more than a simple change of address. It was the deliberate cutting of her lifelines, ensuring that when the true nightmare began, she would have nowhere to turn. In Lansing, Rulloff's public persona flourished, creating an ever starker contrast with the private horror his marriage was becoming. He established a practice as a botanical physician, using his self-taught but extensive knowledge of herbs and medicines to treat local residents. In an era of limited access to formally trained doctors, his reputation as a skilled and compassionate healer grew with astonishing speed. Prominent families throughout the region sought his services, and his reasonable fees and seemingly genuine concern for his patients further cemented his status as an invaluable member of the community. Their modest home became a center of intellectual activity. The rooms were filled with books on subjects ranging from classical languages to natural philosophy. To any observer, he was the ideal man, a practical healer for the body and a theoretical scholar of the mind. In April of 1845, Harriet gave birth to a daughter they named Priscilla. For a brief, hopeful time, the infant's arrival seemed to calm Rulloff's volatile nature, bringing forth a tenderness that few had ever suspected he possessed. He appeared devoted to both his wife and child. speaking frequently of his ambitious plans for their future, plans that often involved moving west to Ohio, where he claimed a prestigious college professorship awaited a place where his genius would finally receive the recognition it deserved. But this fragile domestic tranquility was soon shattered by the continued, and, in Rulloff's mind, intrusive presence of a man named Dr. Henry Bull. Bull was a genuine physician, Harriet's cousin, and the very man who had generously taken Rulloff under his wing to help establish his botanical practice. He was a pillar of the extended Schutt family network, maintaining the kind of easy, affectionate relationships with his female relatives that was common in the close-knit rural communities of the time. But what should have been natural and unremarkable became, in Rulloff's paranoid and twisted mind, the source of a growing, obsessive rage. Dr. Bull's friendly demeanor, his familial affection for Harriet, often expressed with a simple kiss on the cheek, the same gesture that had triggered Rulloff's wedding day outburst, drove the scholar into paroxysms of jealous fury. He became utterly convinced, with no evidence whatsoever, that his wife was engaged in a sordid affair with her own cousin. The brilliant scholar who could eloquently discuss philosophy and literature became a monster of suspicion and violence within the walls of his own home, his accusations growing more wild and his temper more dangerous with each passing day. The crisis that would shatter multiple families and stain the region for a generation began in May of 1845, when tragedy first struck the extended Schutt clan. Harriet's sister-in-law, the wife of her brother William, fell gravely ill shortly after giving birth to a second child. Both the young mother and her newborn infant were suffering from what appeared to be a severe infection. In their desperation, the family naturally turned to their learned relative by marriage, the man who had established himself as the area's most skilled healer. Rulloff agreed to treat them. He prepared an herbal remedy with the focused precision of a master pharmacist and administered it personally, his face a mask of deep concern. Within 48 hours of receiving Rulloff's treatment, both the young mother and her infant child were dead. While such deaths were tragically common in an era before modern medicine, the timing and circumstances struck some family members as deeply suspicious. Their suspicion turned to horror when they observed Rulloff himself. He showed no grief. Instead, he made ominous, chilling comments to his mother-in-law about who in the family might go next. The words, as she would later recount, sounded less like an expression of sorrow and more like a veiled threat. The deaths created an immediate and irreparable rift. The Schutt family's previous unspoken reservations about Rulloff now crystallized into active, open hostility. Whispers began to circulate, hushed but insistent, questioning whether the supposed healer had, in fact, hastened the deaths of his own relatives. The pressure cooker atmosphere within the family was about to explode. Feeling the weight of their suspicion, Rulloff became more desperate than ever to flee. His demands that Harriet abandon her family and move to Ohio with him becoming more insistent and violent. He could not comprehend her loyalty to them over her devotion to him, to his paranoid mind. It was proof that they had turned her against him. On the humid, oppressive evening of June 22nd, 1845, as a summer thunderstorm rumbled across Cayuga Lake and lightning tore across the darkening sky, Edward Rulloff committed the crime that would forever define his legacy. The air in their small house in Lansing was thick with tension. Another vicious argument had erupted, this time over his frantic demands that they leave for Ohio immediately. Harriet, still grieving, firmly refused to abandon her family. She was in the kitchen, engaged in the mundane domestic task of crushing peppercorns with a heavy iron pestle, when she laughed off his latest wild accusation of infidelity. Something fundamental and irreparable snapped in the scholar's brilliant but twisted mind. In a final volcanic explosion of pure rage, fueled by months of paranoid jealousy and a lifetime of perceived slights, Rulloff snatched the iron pestle from his wife's hands. He brought it down upon her forehead with a single devastating blow. The impact was delivered with such savage force that she collapsed instantly, a massive wound gushing blood onto the kitchen floor. The sickening sound of the impact seemed to echo through the small house, followed by an eerie, profound silence, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. Rulloff stood over his wife's body, watching as the life drained from the woman he claimed to love, feeling no remorse. Documents from his later confession revealed that his only emotion was a cold, chilling satisfaction that she would never defy him again. But his monstrous work was not yet complete. As Harriet lay dying, their infant daughter, Priscilla, began to cry from her cradle in the next room, disturbed by the commotion. The sound of the baby's wailing pierced through Rulloff's rage, but it did not evoke pity. It reminded him that there was a witness who, though an infant now, would one day grow old enough to remember, to speak, to testify, with the same calculating coldness that had marked his academic pursuits. He made a second, terrible decision, moving to his collection of botanical medicines. He prepared what he would later describe only as a narcotic, likely a concentrated dose of the same plant-based poisons he had studied so intently. The preparation was done with the calm precision of a trained pharmacist. He returned to the cradle where Priscilla continued to cry. With gentle hands, he administered the poison. The baby's cries gradually weakened, then softened, and then stopped entirely. The house was now filled with a new kind of quiet, a terrible, absolute silence that would haunt the very walls of that home for generations to come. In the space of less than an hour, the brilliant scholar had transformed from a respected healer into a cold-blooded killer, and had single-handedly annihilated his entire family. The disappearance of Harriet and Priscilla Rulloff in the last week of June 1845 did not begin as a whisper. It began as a shockwave that radiated through the close-knit community of Lansing. In the days following the violent thunderstorm, a profound and unsettling silence emanated from the Rulloff home. When concerned neighbors, accustomed to the household's routines, came calling, they found Edward Rulloff alone. His explanations for his family's absence were immediate, but they were also profoundly suspicious, raising more questions with each passing hour. The scene inside the small house told a story that directly contradicted every placid explanation their host offered. It was not the home of a family on a planned journey. It was a scene of hasty, chaotic abandonment. Beds were left unmade, the sheets twisted and thrown aside as if in a struggle. Dirty dishes were scattered across the kitchen table, suggesting a meal left unfinished. Personal belongings lay strewn about the rooms in a state of disarray. But amidst this chaos, one object stood out with a silent, damning eloquence. On Harriet's bureau, alongside her jewelry and other precious possessions, sat her cherished traveling basket. To the women of the community, this was the single most incriminating piece of evidence. They knew Harriet's character intimately. She was a woman of meticulous habits and deep familial devotion. That basket was a constant companion on any journey, no matter how brief. The idea that she would depart for a prolonged trip to Ohio or anywhere else without it was not just unlikely, it was utterly inconceivable. It was the first piece of concrete, irrefutable evidence, a quiet testament that Harriet Schutt hadn't left her home willingly. Rulloff's attempts to explain his family's sudden absence only served to deepen the growing mystery and suspicion. His stories changed with each telling. the narrative shifting and evolving as if he were improvising details on the fly. Initially, he claimed that Harriet and Priscilla had gone to visit relatives in a cottage nestled between Cayuga and Seneca lakes. When pressed for specifics, for exact locations or expected return dates, his answers were vague and evasive. When this story failed to satisfy his questioners, he abruptly switched to a new tale of them visiting family in Erie, Pennsylvania. Finally, he settled on an elaborate and detailed account of their relocation to Madison, Ohio, to prepare for his alleged professorship. Each new version of events, each desperate fabrication, raised more questions than it answered and shredded his credibility further. The more Rulloff talked, the less believable his stories became, and the more convinced his listeners grew that something terrible had befallen his wife and child. When confronted directly about these glaring inconsistencies, Rulloff, with the performative flair of a seasoned actor, offered to write a letter to his wife, asking her to contact her distraught family. The letter was duly written in his precise, scholarly hand, filled with flowery language expressing concern for her family's worries. But days turned into agonizing weeks, and no response ever came. A profound silence that spoke far louder than any words could have. For 6 weeks, Rulloff maintained his increasingly desperate charade, continuing his practice as a botanical physician, treating patients with the same apparent skill and compassion that had built his reputation. All the while, he knew the truth of what lay hidden beneath the dark, silent waters of Cayuga Lake. But the community's suspicions, led by the now frantic Schott family, were hardening into certainty. Harriet's protective brothers, William and Ephraim, refused to accept Rulloff's evolving explanations. Their investigation began to yield disturbing information. Several neighbors came forward, their testimony forming a chilling timeline. They reported seeing Rulloff on the morning after his family's supposed departure, loading mysterious, heavy bundles and what appeared to be a large, weighty chest into a wagon borrowed from a local family. Witnesses described his demeanor as nervous and furtive, a stark contrast to his usual confident, commanding bearing. Most significantly, multiple people reported seeing him driving the loaded wagon in the pre-dawn hours. He was not on the road to Pennsylvania or Ohio. He was on a route that led directly toward the deep, cold, and unforgiving waters of Cayuga Lake. The community organized a systematic search, one of the most thorough criminal investigations of its era. Teams of men worked in shifts, using grappling hooks, nets, and primitive diving equipment to dredge the lake's murky depths. But Cayuga Lake, extending for nearly 40 miles and reaching depths of over 400 feet, was a formidable accomplice. Despite weeks of intensive searching, no trace of Harriet or Priscilla was ever found. The lake kept its grim secret. As the pressure of the investigation and the weight of community suspicion became too great to bear, Rulloff suddenly vanished from Lansing. He claimed he was finally going to Ohio to rejoin his family and bring them back, to silence the unfair accusations once and for all. His departure in the dead of night, without settling his affairs, was the final confirmation of his guilt. But Ephraim Schott was not a man to let his sister's suspected killer escape justice through flight. A man of considerable determination and physical courage, he mounted his buckboard and set off in hot pursuit, beginning a dramatic cross-state manhunt that would become the stuff of local legend. It was a raw, primal chase, a test of wills between a grieving brother seeking vengeance and a brilliant killer desperately trying to outrun the consequences of his crimes. The pursuit reached its cinematic climax on a crowded train platform in Rochester. There, amidst the steam and chaos of departing trains, Ephraim spotted Rulloff attempting to board a train bound for Buffalo and points west. For a moment, Rulloff tried to disappear into the crowd, using his keen understanding of human psychology to evade detection. But Ephraim's determination proved stronger than his cunning. After a thorough search of the train cars, he found the fugitive hiding. Cornered, Rulloff did not confess. He did not show fear. Instead, in a display of breathtaking audacity, he expressed surprise and pleasure at encountering his brother-in-law. He claimed the meeting was fortuitous, as he was indeed on his way to rejoin Harriet and Priscilla, and even had the nerve to suggest that Ephraim accompany him to see for himself that all was well. The two men traveled onward to Buffalo together, a journey thick with unspoken tension, each man playing a dangerous game. The next morning, as they made their way to the crowded docks to catch a steamboat for Cleveland, Rulloff demonstrated the cunning that had served him so well, using the confusion of a busy port as cover. He managed to slip away from Ephraim's watchful eye, disappearing into the press of passengers. By the time Ephraim realized his quarry had escaped, Rulloff had vanished completely. The escape was a masterstroke of evasion, but it was also a final, non-verbal confession. Standing alone on the docks, Ephraim Schutt was now more convinced than ever that his sister and niece were dead. In 1845, nearly a year after the disappearance, the wheels of justice, though slow, finally caught up with Edward Rulloff. He was tracked down in Pennsylvania, where he had already begun to establish a new identity. He was arrested and brought back to New York to face charges. The legal proceedings that followed would span decades, revealing the true extent of his criminal genius and the dangerous flaws in an American justice system unequipped to handle such a predator. The prosecution faced an almost impossible task. The legal principle of corpus delicti, the rule that a murder cannot be prosecuted without proof of death. Typically, a body was their greatest obstacle. Without the bodies of Harriet and Priscilla, they were forced to build their case entirely on circumstantial evidence. The grand jury, recognizing this difficulty, chose to indict Rulloff not for murder, but on the lesser charge of kidnapping his wife. The trial became a spectacle. Rulloff, dismissing his own lawyers, chose to conduct his own defense. He demonstrated a mastery of legal precedent and argumentation that astonished court observers and frustrated prosecutors. He was brilliant, dissecting witness testimony and relentlessly hammering on the lack of physical evidence. Despite his legal brilliance, however, the sheer weight of the circumstantial evidence against him was overwhelming. In 1846, he was found guilty of kidnapping and sentenced to 10 years of hard labor at the notorious Auburn State Prison. Rather than breaking his spirit, prison became his sanctuary and his university. He threw himself into academic pursuits with an obsessive dedication. He used his confinement to teach himself the complex science of philology, the study of language development. His cell was transformed into a scholar's study, filled with books on linguistics and classical languages. His intellectual pursuits were not mere hobbies. They were part of a grandiose plan to achieve the academic fame he believed he deserved. He began working on a massive treatise, a work he was convinced would revolutionize the field and earn him immortality. His reputation as a criminal genius grew to legendary proportions within the prison walls. He tutored fellow inmates, consulted with guards, and even taught classes for curious intellectuals and reformers who came to witness the phenomenon of a brilliant scholar in a convict's uniform. Upon his release in 1856, after serving his full sentence, he was immediately rearrested. The Tompkins County District Attorney, in a clever legal maneuver to bypass double jeopardy laws, had him indicted for a separate crime, the murder of his infant daughter, Priscilla. Rulloff was tried again, convicted, and this time sentenced to death. But his decade of legal study in prison had not been wasted. His defense team mounted a sophisticated appeal, again citing the corpus delicti rule. And in 1858, while confined in the Ithaca jail awaiting the outcome of this appeal, he vanished. The escape was audacious and clearly orchestrated with inside assistance from Albert Jarvis, a young man who had become his devoted student in prison. Rulloff was free once more, a fugitive from a death sentence. He had successfully outmaneuvered the law at every turn. A brilliant monster unleashed back into a world that was no closer to understanding him or stopping him. Free, once again, Edward Rulloff, now a fugitive from a death sentence, embarked on the most audacious and productive phase of his criminal career. He did not retreat into the shadows. Instead, he strode into the heart of the nation's largest metropolis, New York City, and reinvented himself yet again. No longer a lone wolf, he became the intellectual mastermind of a sophisticated criminal enterprise. He formed a gang with his ever-loyal acolyte, Albert Jarvis, and a professional burglar named William T. Dexter. Together, under Rulloff's meticulous planning, they executed a series of high-end burglaries that targeted stores carrying expensive silks and luxury goods, items that were easily transported and sold in distant markets. Rulloff's role was that of a general, directing his operations with what was described as military precision. His scholarly reputation, which he cultivated in his Brooklyn neighborhood, provided the perfect cover. He was living a stunningly successful double life, a respected intellectual by day, a criminal kingpin by night. But the profits from his crimes were merely a means to an end. Rulloff's primary, all-consuming obsession remained the validation of his genius. He spent every spare moment perfecting his life's work. The linguistic treatise he titled Method in the Formation of Language. He genuinely believed this work would revolutionize the field, placing him in the pantheon of history's great thinkers, and finally earning him the immortality he so desperately craved. In 1869, he learned of the first convention of the American Philological Association. He saw it as his golden opportunity. Under the carefully crafted alias of Professor Yuri Loriot, he submitted his manuscript, convinced the academic world was about to be brought to its knees by his brilliance. In a move that revealed the true depth of his megalomania, he announced his intention to auction the manuscript for the staggering sum of $500,000, a fortune in the 19th century. The response from the academic community was not just a rejection, it was a silent, dismissive shrug. The Philological Association showed no interest whatsoever in his theories, casting his life's work aside without serious consideration. For a man like Rulloff, whose entire identity was built upon a foundation of intellectual superiority, this was not a mere professional setback. It was a profound psychological wound, a narcissistic injury of catastrophic proportions. The very world he had spent decades trying to conquer had deemed him irrelevant. That rejection pushed him over the edge. It crystallized all his resentments, all his paranoid beliefs about a society that had failed to appreciate his exceptional gifts. The calculated criminal mastermind began to transform into something far more dangerous. If the world would not recognize his genius voluntarily, he would force it to acknowledge his power through acts of increasing boldness and violence. His crimes after 1869 became more daring, more brutal, as if he was simultaneously punishing the world and challenging law enforcement to stop him. The brilliant scholar was collapsing under the weight of his own hubris, devolving into a killer who felt the world owed him a debt he was now prepared to collect in blood. It was during this period of escalating desperation that Albert Jarvis brought Rulloff word of a seemingly perfect opportunity. The Halbert Brothers dry goods store in Binghamton had just received a large, valuable shipment of expensive silks. It was their gang's specialty. The location was ideal, the security seemingly lax. With only two young clerks living in the quarters above the store, on the humid, oppressive early morning hours of August 17th, 1870, the three men, Rulloff, Jarvis, and Dexter, approached the store with the confidence of professionals. Their plan, conceived by Rulloff, was a model of cold precision. They would subdue the sleeping clerks with chloroform, take the silks, and disappear into the night. But in the unfamiliar darkness of the building, a single moment of carelessness undid decades of meticulous planning. Jarvis stumbled, sending a crash echoing through the silent structure. The sound jolted the two clerks, Frederick Merrick and Gilbert Burroughs, instantly awake. The carefully planned burglary descended into chaos in the ensuing struggle. Frederick Merrick, displaying remarkable courage, grabbed a pistol he kept for emergencies. He aimed it at the fleeing figure of Rulloff and pulled the trigger. The weapon clicked, but failed to discharge a misfire that would cost the brave young clerk his life. Undeterred, Merrick continued to fight. It was then that Edward Rulloff, his patience shattered, made the decision that would finally seal his fate. He drew his own pistol. He fired a warning shot, then another, when Merrick still would not desist. Rulloff's self-control snapped completely. He pointed his weapon directly at the young clerk's head and without hesitation or remorse, pulled the trigger. The bullet struck Frederick Merrick instantly, killing him where he stood. In that moment, Rulloff was no longer just a suspected murderer from a long-forgotten past. He was a killer with a fresh victim, a dead body, and a living witness. The three criminals fled in panic toward the nearby Chenango River. In his desperation, Rulloff made a fatal miscalculation, assuring his partners the river was shallow enough to wade across. As they plunged into the dark water, the powerful current overwhelmed them. Jarvis and Dexter, one wounded and the other unable to swim, were swept away to their deaths. Only Edward Rulloff, the mastermind whose brilliant plan had led to this disaster, managed to struggle to the far shore, alone and exhausted, with the sounds of a city-wide manhunt erupting behind him. His capture was almost anticlimactic. He was found hiding in a farmer's outhouse, his wit and charm finally exhausted. The definitive proof of his presence at the crime scene was found back in the store, a single left shoe, unmistakably his. Stuffed with cloth to accommodate the missing big toe he had lost to frostbite years earlier. It was an identifying mark as unique as a fingerprint, a piece of concrete evidence that not even his legal genius could dispute. His past finally caught up to him when a local judge, who had followed the notorious case for years, recognized him, declaring for all to hear, "You are Edward H. Rulloff. You murdered your wife and child in Lansing in 1845. The trial that began in January 1871 was a national sensation. Newspapers across the country sent reporters to cover the proceedings. Fascinated by the paradox of America's most intellectual killer, Rulloff, once again, conducted his own defense with astonishing skill. But this time, the evidence was simply too overwhelming. He was swiftly convicted and sentenced to hang. Even as he faced certain execution, his grandiose delusions persisted. He petitioned the governor to delay his hanging until he could complete his linguistic theories, claiming his work would benefit all of humanity. The plea sparked a national debate. The famous editor Horace Greeley argued such a brilliant mind was too valuable to waste. The writer Mark Twain, with his characteristic wit, satirized these efforts, offering to provide a substitute criminal to be executed in Rulloff's place. In the end, all appeals failed. As he awaited his execution, he finally confessed to murdering his wife, Harriet, describing in chilling detail how he had struck her with the iron pestle. He never, however, confessed to killing his daughter, Priscilla, stating only that he had given her a narcotic to stop her crying, leaving one final, haunting secret to die with him. On May 18th, 1871, before a bloodthirsty crowd of thousands, Edward Howard Rulloff met his end at the gallows in what would be New York State's final public hanging. His reported last words were a reflection of the defiant, arrogant, and complex man he was. "Hurry it up, I want to be in hell in time for dinner." But death was not the end of Edward Rulloff's story. It was merely the beginning of his macabre legacy. Within hours of his execution, his brain was removed by a professor from Cornell University for scientific study, bringing our story full circle. It remains on display there to this day, floating in its jar, a silent, enduring monument to one of America's most complex and dangerous killers. Rulloff's case forced 19th century America to confront uncomfortable truths. It shattered the prevailing, comforting beliefs that linked criminal behavior to low intelligence, poverty, or lack of education. Rulloff was living proof that evil could wear the most respectable of masks. That intellectual brilliance was no guarantee whatsoever of moral character. His case became a foundational text in the developing field of criminal psychology. He was one of the first American criminals to be systematically studied by scientists seeking a physical, tangible link between the structure of the brain and the capacity for criminal behavior. They subjected his preserved brain to every test available to them, but they found no answers, no tumor, no lesion, no physical abnormality could explain the evil that had resided within it. Today, modern psychologists examining the extensive historical records of his behavior have concluded that he displayed virtually every characteristic of what we now understand as clinical psychopathy. The charming facade that concealed a murderous intent, the grandiose, inflated sense of self-importance that justified any action, the complete and chilling lack of empathy for the suffering of his victims, and the uncanny ability to manipulate others through displays of intelligence and charm. In many ways, he was America's first celebrity serial killer, a man whose horrific crimes were overshadowed only by the terrifying brilliance of the mind that conceived them. The case of the genius killer serves as an eternal and deeply unsettling reminder. It reminds us that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear the most civilized, and that the capacity for evil exists entirely independent of intelligence, education, or social standing. Edward Rulloff's ultimate legacy is not the linguistic theories he believed would make him immortal. It is, instead, the chilling and undeniable demonstration that a genius without a conscience is not a gift to humanity. It is a weapon capable of destroying innocent lives, and a dark mirror reflecting the terrifying truth that the greatest monsters are often the ones we create ourselves.